מעביר את השליטה לצביקה אקשטיין. צביקה יציג את מרטין אייכנבאום שיישא את הרצאת פטינקין בכנס זה.
תודה בני, כבוד ועונג לי, רב לי להציג את פרופסור מרטין אייכנבאום באוניברסיטת נורת'ווסטרן ובעברית להציג אותו. הוא חבר דירקטוריון בוועדה מדעית במכון אהרון. נפגשנו לראשונה לאחר שיעור מקרו ראשון בסתיו 76 מרטין במינסוטה. מרטין הציג את עצמו כדובר עברית בבית הספר היהודי במונטריאול וניסיונות לעבוד עם הקרובים בישראל לשמור על השפה. אבל בסוף השנה הראשונה כבר למדנו יחד למבחני אפרילים במעבר לדוקטורט, כאשר השיחות היו בעברית או ג'יבריש, במונחים באנגלית. שנינו פילסנו את דרכנו יחד, ויישמנו את המודלים של קריס סימס וטום סארג'נט, אשר לימדו אותנו בשנים האלו, ואחר כך קיבלו עליהם נובל. היינו מהראשונים שעשו זאת. מרטין, מודל מקרו של מלאים, איתו הגיע לקרנגי מלון. מרטין משם עבד עם הנסן ועם סינגלטון, ובמיוחד החל קריירה מסחררת במקרו, אשר נסקה בנורת'ווסטרן. אני חייב לציין את המאמר עם אבנס וקריסטיאנו ב-JP 2002 כנקודת מפנה במודלים מקרו-מוניטריים בעת המודרנית. עבודותיו לאורך השנים במכלול הנושאים של מדיניות מוניטרית, ובמיוחד מאמרים שלאחרונה מראים את מידת ההתאמה של המסגרת של מודלים, מה שאני קורא DSGE, לתהליך המקרו-כלכלי מוניטרי במשבר, הביאו לתרומה ממש משמעותית על המחקר האקדמי בכלל ועל מדיניות בפועל, שממשיכה עם המודלים הללו, ובנוסף שלל מאמרים על שערי חליפין והחיבור בין המערכת הפיננסית למקרו. ובמיוחד אני ממליץ בימים אלו לכם כולכם לקרוא את עבודותיו על חוסר הסימטריה המומלצת במדיניות פיסקלית סביב שער ריבית אפס. מרטין, בבקשה, כמובן שאתה תרצה באנגלית.
Thank you very much, Zvika. It's always a pleasure, and in this case, a real honor to see you again, but of course to give the Don Pattinkin lecture, something which I will come back to later in the lecture. Let me begin by reminding everyone that the initial response of most governments to the COVID epidemic was to implement what I will call simple containment measures, and I'll give you examples of that later on. A fundamental problem or limitation of that strategy was simple containment implies a very sharp negative trade-off between the level of economic activity and the health consequences of an epidemic. Now, as an American, I'm very aware that that simply was not sustainable politically in the United States, and I suspect in other countries as well. So whether you thought they were good policies or bad policies, the trade-off was so negative, it was just not something that could be sustainable. But there are alternatives, which I've called smart contained policies. In my own work, I've emphasized testing and quarantining that dramatically improve the trade-off between economic activity and health outcomes. So it's important to put some of this discussion in context, which is that epidemiology models are widely used were initially to predict the course of the epidemic. And this was quite a revelation for me and my colleagues. These models are very useful, and we could talk about the dimensions along which they're useful. They suffer from one very important shortcoming, and that is they just don't allow for the interaction between people's decisions. I call them economic decisions, but they're people's decisions and rates of infection. So for example, we know that the epidemic causes a recession as people consume and work less to reduce their chances of getting infected. They don't need the government to tell them to do that. But the amount that people work and consume, of course, influences the rate at which infections spread. So the absence of these basic interactions limited the usefulness of simple epidemiology models for forecasting and policy analysis. And so perhaps because economists are imperialists, or because we just care about the environment that we live in, the crisis has created an explosion of work that tries to combine economics and epidemiology. So let me turn to some of my own work and then get into some details, which in the first paper that I wrote with Matthias Trabant and Sergio Rebello, we emphasized that an epidemic is unusual as an economic event because it has both aggregate demand and aggregate supply effects. And that's, in principle, that's always true, but in a COVID sort of situation, it's very stark. What's the supply effect? Well, an epidemic exposes people who are working to the virus, and people naturally react to that risk by reducing their labor supply, very naturally. But there's also a demand effect, which is the epidemic exposes people who are purchasing consumption goods to the virus. And people react to that risk by reducing their consumption. So if you put those two together at the very large, we have both a supply effect and a demand effect are both working in the same direction to generate a large, persistent recession. That's important to understand, that the severe recession would occur even if the government didn't institute any containment policies. Now, sometimes people say, oh, economics is very extreme, etc. But this is really one example where the evidence is quite overwhelming that these basic economic forces are working in reality. And a good example of that is an article by Alm, Lee, and Schum, who systematically look at empirical evidence from a variety of countries to document the extent to which government containment policies added to natural recession that would have happened otherwise. But today I want to talk about two important roles for the government. And the first is extremely neoclassical. It's a classic externality, you can call it Pigouvian, but it's just a simple externality, which is people that are infected with the virus don't fully internalize the effect of their consumption and work decisions on the spread of the virus. And actually, the best analogy that I got, I remember speaking early on to a journalist who said, well, let me understand, is this like pollution? And I said, yes. He said, oh, I see. He got it. And he said, well, right, if I go in my car for a drive, he said, I mean, this is something we teach Economics 101. I go in my car. I don't think the total amount of pollution is affecting the stock of pollution, because after all, I'm just a small agent. And of course, if everyone does that, we get too much pollution, and that leads to a natural role for the government in containing pollution, a tax. Well, it's exactly the same thing, of course, with a virus. When I go out either to work or to consume, I take the total amount of infections as a given, which is appropriate for an atomistic agent. So we have an infection externality. And that naturally leads to the question of, okay, we have an externality, what policies should the government pursue to deal with it? So simple containment policies, an example are lockdowns, which we certainly experienced in the United States, and I know in Israel early on. Those simple containment policies definitely make the recession worse, but in fact, they raise welfare. How do they do that? They reduce the death toll by enough that they more than make up for the recession that would occur under a competitive equilibrium. I'll say more about that in a few moments. Now, in contrast to simple containment, smart containment says, look, you don't want to lock down everyone without taking into account their health status. So, for example, in some of the things I'll talk about, health status becomes really critical, which naturally leads you to testing. Tracing has been formalized in economic models by Fernando Alvarez and others. And of course, quite naturally, age is an obvious thing to take into account when it comes to containment policies. And Daron Acemoglu and co-authors have looked at that as well. Now, we emphasize testing, and it's of course expensive, but the social return is enormous. And one way to think about that social return is to do a rough calculation. Here I'm simply citing Larry Summers in a recent talk, where he calculates that COVID is costing the US economy, and I put this in red because it's a staggering number, $80 billion a day. Let me repeat that. COVID cost the US economy roughly $80 billion a day. But to go to Israel, I did some calculations, take roughly 2% of that. If you think that the two countries are analogous in other ways, that might be off, but it's still obviously an enormous number. Now, the US has so far spent $5 trillion on various fiscal measures. It's a staggering number, but that's roughly what it is. But less than 2% of that $5 trillion has been on investments directly related to COVID. So that's an important thing to consider. The other thing that I want to talk about briefly is the COVID recession won't be over until the health crisis is convincingly contained. This is not a simple Keynesian, increase aggregate demand and life is perfect. We are going to continue with a slowdown until the health crisis is contained. And in reality, actual recessions create inefficient job losses. So that's above and beyond the simple models I'll talk about today, but it's things that we're working on. Why are we concerned about that? Well, we know that destruction, there are lots of destruction of firms and very firm-specific complementarities. Good companies that would otherwise be productive, et cetera, are potentially going broke because of COVID. We know that there's job losses and the loss of firm-specific capital. People who are matched to a firm, there's match-specific productivity that gets destroyed, not necessarily in an optimal way. And of course, we know that unemployed people become disengaged from the workforce, and that has independent effects that various people have worked on. So a particular person I know in the private sector also had a great analogy, and he said, oh, what we want to do is build a bridge over the COVID crisis. He said, look, once the COVID crisis is over, why can't we just restart? Well, it's not all that simple, but the basic analogy seems to me right, that we're trying to build a bridge over these troubled waters. Now, in reality, the contours of that bridge are complicated because we need to balance inefficient job losses and the obvious fact that we need sectoral reallocation. So the details of the specific programs are very much in question, and I don't think they would be necessarily the same in Israel or in the United States, but the fundamental principle of building a bridge, I think, is true. I will want to come back and talk about, should Israel be paralyzed by the fiscal costs of the intervention? And I will try to argue briefly, but as forcefully as I can, that Israel should not be paralyzed by those fiscal costs. Okay, so the organization of the talk and the time that remains to me, I want to talk about a simple SEER macro model, which integrates economic activity and epidemics, and change the trade-offs between economic and health outcomes. And then in new work, and this I presented very briefly in memoriam to Don Pattinkin, who is, of course, a pioneer in the development, or if you like, early stages of Keynesian economics, formalizing those insights. I want to extend the framework that some of you may have seen in my own work of putting COVID in explicitly a neoclassical growth model and then a new Keynesian model, which allows for various rigidities. And then turn to the question of whether Israel has the fiscal space to build a bridge across this very severe crisis that we face right now. Okay, well, I don't want to do any equations. I know it's late in Israel, even though it's early here. But to give you the basic contours and the kind of results that come from this new literature. The basic point of departure is the classic SEER model proposed by Kermack and McKendrick, which I had come across a number of years ago when thinking about housing and how people form expectations. But in our context here, there are exogenous transition probabilities between health states. So that's important. In the SEER model, it's entirely exogenous, those transitions. And we think of the population, basically as being divided into 4 groups. And what are those groups? Well, we have there are susceptible people who haven't yet been exposed to the disease, infected people who have contracted the disease, recovered. They've survived from the disease, and for now, I will assume they've acquired immunity, although it's a very important point I want to come back to. There's not a lot of evidence that this is actually true, that you acquire immunity permanently. And then sadly, the last group, they are deceased people, namely those people who have died from the disease. So what can an economist bring to this basic framework? Well, the basic point is that we are people in the end, despite, sometimes we use terrible words like agents, but they're really just people. And we interact in at least goods and labor markets, other markets as well, but at a minimum, goods and labor markets. And that new infections often arise from those types of social interactions. So you can imagine in a model having non-economic social interactions, which is a sort of random, going for a walk, meeting your neighbor, going to synagogue, etc. Things not motivated explicitly by economics, but consumption-based activities, going to restaurants, going to, when I was young, rock concerts or symphony, and of course, work-related activities. And I must say, the epidemiologists are very good at documenting transmission rates of historical diseases in different types of consumption activities or different types of work-related activities. So if you are school children have very different transmission rates than other, let me call that work, than other types of work, and that's very useful literature. As they say, susceptible people can become infected from these interactions, and they can recover or die. And as I said, for now, tentatively, I'm going to assume that recovered people can't become infected again. In the model, we're going to assume that the government can impose various forms of containment. The simplest version is a simple containment, which we can think of now as essentially a tax on consumption activities that is implemented in a way that doesn't differentiate people on the basis of their health status. The tax analogy is useful in the model, but you can imagine the government, there's an isomorphic thing from the government, which just says, look, you're not allowed to do that activity. That in some appendix, we show that that amounts to the same thing, actually numerically. Now, in any kind of model that one builds, there are many, many details about how to parameterize it, but from a bird's eye view, decisions have to be made about infection probabilities, how risk-averse agents are. Very importantly, to allow into the model constraints on the medical system. Obviously, one of the big issues early in the crisis, and God forbid in a second wave, is whether we overwhelm the medical system and how that impacts on death rates. Very, very important point in an economic model, how do agents think of, in reasonable ways, the possible future arrival of vaccinations? Will they come with some probability within a quarter of a year? Unlikely. A year, 2 years, etc. And just as importantly, treatments, right? How quickly will we get treatments? Now, treatments differ because they would affect everyone, including those infected. Vaccinations would affect everyone, but not those who have already been infected. So these are quite distinct categories of activities, of inventions. This is the sort of thing that comes out of our benchmark model, and it looks like very busy, but let me just take you through a few of the highlights. What's in the blue is our basic model, which says, look, let the competitive equilibrium be what it is. There's no intervention by the government. What would happen? Well, in the large, what would happen is we would get the sort of classic graphs that you're all used to seeing from a SEER epidemic, peak in infections, a large number of deaths. Unfortunately, this is expressed as a percent of the initial population. And that's what would happen if you did nothing. What is the dotted black line? Well, the dotted black line says, suppose that you took the best simple containment policy. To be technical for a moment, this is a Ramsey solution to a Ramsey problem, which the government has one instrument, namely the containment tax. To norm what that tax would look like, you can see that the government initially imposes containment, and the size of that containment then grows. Why does it jump immediately? It jumps immediately because the government says, look, Vaccinations may incur. Treatments may occur. We don't want to overwhelm the medical system immediately. So with the very first outbreak, the government is starting to impose containment. As the size of the externality grows, and when is the externality greatest? It's greatest when they're most infected people. So the tax has to rise to match that Pigouvian externality. You see the best containment policy arises and then slowly goes down. One simple metric for how it affects the economy is to look at consumption. You can see in the solid blue line, if the government did nothing, we would have quite a substantial, in this parameterization, decline in aggregate consumption. In the simplest models, that coincides with output. Roughly, this actually looks quite modest compared to what we saw, say a 6% decline on average from peak to trough. On the other hand, notice that what simple containment does, it makes the recession much, much worse. As you tax consumption, you have a much steeper contraction in economic activity with now an average peak to trough decline of roughly 15%, maybe 16%, something like that. How can that be optimal? The reason that's optimal is in this graph over here, look at what happens to deaths as a result of COVID. Deaths peak at a much lower percent of the initial population under simple containment than they would under the competitive equilibrium. And that is and the magnitude of, or the value, I mean, that's a very difficult word, but the social value of preventing deaths is more than sufficient to outweigh the steeper economic decline, but that trade-off is quite steep. Now, one example of the difficulty of that containment is we know, or at least I will speak as an American now, there are intense pressures to abandon simple containment policies precisely because of important distributional consequences, which aren't in my simple model, but also that a lot of people suffer in economic terms under simple containment. So you might ask, what happens if you simply abandon the optimal simple containment policy? Well, the answer is a lot of it depends on when you do it. So in this first row, there are two scenarios. One is simple containment. So the dotted black line is just what we talked about. And the red is what if, after 12 weeks into the infection, the government abandons simple containment and says, we're just going to have to do what we have to do. Well, two key things emerge from here. The first is, in fact, if you abandon, say in this graph here, simple containment policies at week 12, you do in fact get an increase in economic activity. But it's temporary, because as the infection reinvigorates itself, people naturally respond to that rise in infections, and sure enough, whatever benefits you got from the temporary abandonment of containment, you just go back and now you have another, you go back into recession. You pay a terrible price for that. You get a big rise in infections and you get a big rise in deaths. The exact trade-offs and how bad it is to exit early, of course, depend on, did you exit after 12 weeks? Did you exit after 20 weeks, et cetera, et cetera. But the basic message here is, if for some reason simple containment imposes such a harsh cost that governments give up, you'll simply give rise to a larger infection, more deaths, and only a temporary increase in economic activity, temporary being the operative word. Now, much of the existing literature on epidemic assumes that people actually know their current health status. So if you look at the simple models, people know if they're infected or recovered, etc. But of course, if that's true, if health status is public information, there's no role for testing. I don't have to test you if you know. I can just ask you. So obviously, one wants to extend that analysis to suppose that people don't know their true status unless they're tested. And once you know that, we can analyze the effects of testing and quarantining. Now, in principle, there's two reasons to engage in testing. The first is simply we want to obtain better estimates of how many people have been exposed to the virus and refine estimates of the key parameters in epidemiology models. And that's not a trivial reason. The simple fact is when you go into the scientific literature, even as we stand now, we are learning very, very much about the true parameters of infection rates, etc. So that's a very important input into the real world, into actual design of policy. But the other reason for testing is to reduce transmission rates, and I emphasize, by quarantining infected people. As it turns out, testing alone, if this is all you're doing, just testing, that doesn't resolve the key market failure associated with epidemics. So again, as in any model, there are a variety of simplifications one has to make. And in the current draft of one of the papers I've written, we assume tests are perfectly accurate. We know they're not. We can talk about type 1 and type 2 errors. But we assume that these tests are very accurate and they can determine whether a person is susceptible, infected, or recovered. In principle, we're extending this to allow for type 1 and type 2 errors, and the central message doesn't change. There's going to be two types of people. There are people who outside the testing pool have not yet been tested, and there are people who are inside the testing pool and get tested every period until they recover or die. And then in every period, the government tests alpha % of the population that has not yet been tested. So over time, they're testing more and more of the people. And we'll see that in the end, this sort of analysis and the recommendations coming out of it are closely or supportive of proposals by Paul Romer, who has emphasized the importance of testing. Now, it's to be clear, and this is somewhat counterintuitive, but maybe not to economists, but to non-economists, testing without quarantines, so if you just test without quarantines, you actually worsen both the economic and health consequences of an epidemic. Why is that? Well, if I'm not sure about my health status, I'm likely to reduce my economic activity because I don't want to get infected. But if I get tested and find I'm infected, I'll reduce my economic activity by less. And in fact, if more infected people are shopping and working, social interactions become much more risky for non-infected people, and they in turn respond by cutting back on their economic activity. So if you just test and don't quarantine, those forces are quite powerful in these models, and you would actually get a deeper recession and more deaths. So it's just important to bear in mind that when we talk about testing, it's absolutely central that that go along with quarantining. So when we talk about quarantining, the question is, what kind of quarantinement? Well, again, there's going to be a simple and a more complicated version. Simple containment says that infected people don't work. They receive consumption, so the government somehow delivers consumption to them, but we don't literally isolate people from non-economic social interactions. So it's quite severe. It says you can't work, you can't go shopping, but I can't stop you from going for a walk. I'm just let you do your normal sort of things. Strict containment is that infected people are not only isolated from economic activities, but they are also isolated from non-economic social interactions. Now, it turns out that both type of testing and quarantinement strategies dramatically improve the trade-off between economic activity and health outcomes. Recall the problem with simple containment strategy was that we had very dramatic trade-offs. The whole point of these tests is that quarantining is that you minimize those you minimize that trade-off. I want to be a little bit careful with time, and all I'm going to say here is that if you look at this graph here, this dotted line is, the model with unknown health status looks very much like the competitive equilibrium I showed you. Lots of infections, lots of deaths, very severe recession, very similar magnitude to what I showed you. If you go to testing and smart containment, that is to say, quarantining people from economic interactions, notice how you're getting less deaths and a smaller recession. So here, the policy, the better health policy also is the better economic policy. So they're not in conflict. In fact, they help each other. And the most extreme, strict containment, now you essentially have a very small recession and you have dramatically reduced deaths. So that would be the most extreme and hopeful sort of scenario. One last word, and then I'll go on to my little in memoriam to Don Patintkin. There's no hard evidence, by the way, of permanent immunity from infections with SARS. So I cite here Chamand and Galanti, and when we put that scenario into the model where you naturally, people who have recovered from the disease have some probability after a certain amount of time of getting reinfected, they're immune for about 2 years, and then on average they get it again. And the nightmare here, what are these wiggles? These wiggles are reinfection rates, simply because sustainable people are replenishing the pool of people who can get infected. All I'm going to say there is, in this scenario, it becomes even more important than ever to have consistent testing and containment policies because the death toll, if you don't do that, are absolutely frightening and a social catastrophe. But with smart testing and containment, the scenario is much, much better. So that just strengthens the case. Here I say in memoriam to Don Patintkin, and let me just say, what do I mean about that? I was not lucky enough to study under Don Patintkin. I'm old, but not quite that old. We all know, or should know, that he was one of the giants of early contributors to formalize, or thinking about how to get Keynesian rigidities and nominal rigidities into models. So we took this basic SEER macro model and put it into both the neoclassical growth models and New Keynesian models. And here, I'm just going to say, remember that a COVID is both a shock to consumption demand, a negative shock, and a shock to labor supply. In general, it's hard to know what will happen to investment or nominal rigidities under those circumstances. I won't belabor that. But what happens in our model, and we're writing this up now, is when you get an epidemic, you not only get the sharp decline in output, hours worked, and consumption that I talked about, you also get a very sharp decline in investment, so you get classic co-movement that's always very challenging for general equilibrium models. You also get a moderate decline in inflation, and very importantly for policymakers, you get a possibly binding zero lower bound on the nominal interest rate, which is very important for fiscal policy. Here's just a picture. I won't go through it because of time constraints, but I just want you to notice. Interestingly, nominal rigidities don't play very much a first order role in this story. The real shocks are so big that they very much dominate the story. They contribute to the recession, certainly to the decline in investment, but I would say the main story really interestingly comes from the neoclassical growth model. So last few slides, I know I'm running low now. I want to reemphasize that I believe, and the evidence suggests overwhelmingly, that there are inefficient job losses when we create recessions. Otherwise, good businesses, if we didn't have this COVID disease, go broke, and we lose a lot. We lose from specific good firms and the things that they know within firms. We lose firm-specific capital from workers, and tragically, workers who become unemployed for a long time get disassociated from the workforce with potentially terrible damage. So our job is to build, from a macro point of view, a bridge over this COVID crisis. And here it becomes critical to balance inefficient job losses and necessary sectoral allocations. So for example, these raise issues. Do I keep existing firms and give benefits to them so that they keep workers online? Or do I give the benefits directly to workers, which would of course foster sectoral reallocation? So there are many choices of unemployment insurance, contingent loans to firms, courtside type programs. My own view is that we should not be paralyzed by the fiscal costs of these interventions. No one knows exactly, of course, how much the Israeli economy will contract. Pardon? Okay.
The Israeli economy will contract by roughly 6% and won't return, according to the IMF, until 2022. You all know better than me that the Knesset approved a package of $80 billion shekels, about 6.1 of 2020 GDP, and roughly 11 billion for health expenses. Then the Knesset expanded that by about 1.1%. I am absolutely convinced that the deficit will balloon. I have no doubt. But I want to argue very briefly, and other people will talk about this, that there are lots of fiscal space. To begin with, Israel has been less aggressive, and I'll show you a graph in just a moment, than other developed economies. And I want to emphasize, bond markets have shown absolutely no concern whatsoever about Israel's fiscal stance. This is a very beautiful table taken from a paper of a colleague of mine, Efi Ben Melech and Sur Ilan. And it's a very complicated graph, but what these guys did was they looked at the total amount that different countries were spending, including government guarantees. So that's the hard part, as a percent of GDP. I want to point out to you, Israel is over here. I had to make a little marking. It's not so high tech, but it makes the point. If you look at who's above Israel in terms of spending, it's all of the developed countries. So if you judge Israel relative to its peers and aspirational peers, Israel has not been aggressive in its fiscal stance. If you look at bond spreads of Israel versus the USA or Germany, there is simply no indication of any change in concern about Israel vis-a-vis those other countries, none whatsoever. And if you look at the basic interest rate that Israel can borrow at, well, I don't have to tell you, it's extremely low. Israel can borrow at 10-year bonds at less than 1%. Efi Ben Melech has actually looked at what Israel can borrow at in dollars in New York, and that also is very, very low. So we know Israel can borrow at an extremely low rate of return. I believe we know that the fiscal multiplier is higher at the zero lower bound. Not just my work, but other people as well. And we know that we need to build this bridge over the COVID time. So the question becomes, is the rate of return on preserving human and firm capital in the face of an extremely rare disaster higher than 1%? You could say 1%, not entirely fair. I want to add a risk premium. Okay, let's go to 2%. Let's go to 3%. Do we think the social rate of return of those activities is higher than that? Now, my own view is I think it's pretty clear that the answer is yes. And I think it's important to separate issues about social reform, which we may or may not disagree about. So we don't have to set up entitlements as part of the COVID response, and we need to lay out a clear path to normal times, bearing in mind that COVID-related investments, certainly on health and preserving human and firm capital, we can do that, and there's no particular reason to think that the markets are concerned. So let me conclude. Let's not kid ourselves. The way to end the COVID recession is to control COVID. The challenge, one, is to design politically sustainable, smart health policies that minimize the economic costs of that recession. The other challenge is to develop policies that bridge the COVID recession and balance the preservation of human capital and sectoral reallocation. The bridge is expensive, but has a very high social rate of return. And precisely because of its past fiscal responsibility, Israel has the capacity to build that bridge. So the question I leave you with is, if you have to take one of two risks, do you want to build the bridge too short or too far? I think I know which one I will regret more if I make a mistake. Thank you.
Thanks, Marty, for this really fascinating talk of the very broad issues that you have touched upon and this very intricate model. There are a couple of questions that have come up. And one of them, actually, in some way, I think related. Let me start by, of course, you mentioned Patintkin and Keynesian economics, and of course, in the background we have this very cynical comment: in the long run, we are all dead. So now, of course, right? I mean, probably you're not talking about the long run, probably for a lot of people, and indeed, one of the questions was, how do you model the utility of death? And then related to that is, and you sort of touched upon it, the question of investment in relation to this question, also the longevity and risk involved with that. So that's essentially, bringing together all these questions.
Well, let me first talk about the death question, because it's, let me give a straight analytical answer, because there are lots of philosophical issues that one could raise. We are very much in the tradition of Kip Viscusi and Bob Hall, Chad Jones, etc., where death is modeled as the premature ending of life. So think of life as having some expected utility, which we can translate into consumption equivalent or something like that. Death, the value of death, is the cessation of the benefits of life in these models. Now you can ask, how do you parameterize that? So there is a large micro literature, I cited Viscusi, who looked at revealed preference for how people, through their behavior, value death. And of course, there's a lot of heterogeneity, and that's a shortcoming of our model, that we don't have heterogeneity. But these models, in our model, were calibrated to the value that Viscusi used. And we've done extensive sensitivity analysis. Viscusi used the number, we can argue about this, $9 million is the quote average value of a life. You can vary parameters in the model, particularly the discount rate beta, or use an additive constant in the utility function and see what happens if the value of life was $3 million or 1.5. The qualitative results absolutely go through, but the details of the numbers, of course, do matter if you care about $9 million or you care about $3 million, and the depth of the recession as you respond to the risk of losing those things. So, I mean, I hope that answers it in a technical way, if not a philosophical way. I will say one thing, and I've always had very hard time talking to non-economists about our attitude, because the philosophical people say, oh, but life is infinite. And I've really struggled for a way to explain it to non-economists, and my son actually had the best way of explaining it to non-economists. And he said, do you think the speed limit should be 2 miles an hour in cars? And people go, of course not. And then he says, well, I guess you don't think the value of life is infinite, that we must make those trade-offs. They're hard. It's not just economists should do it. We provide input to politicians and rabbis, et cetera, all have to be part of that process, but that's the strict economics of it. Investment's really hard in these models because normally, if you just have consumption smoothing, you would expect investment might actually really go up in these kind of a crisis, right? Because consumption is low now, so why not build a lot of capital for investment later on? That's part of the intuition, but it turns out to be overwhelmed by the labor supply effects. And so that's why you don't get a typical neoclassical response. I know that's a little technical and we have to write that up, but it's really critical to understanding what this model does, to understand it's not just a shock to consumption demand, it's also a negative shock to labor supply. So that becomes really critical. In the real world, the question, this is really our model, is a prediction about normal investment. There's a separate question about what should the Israeli government invest in, or what should the American government invest in. I think that's a country-specific question. The question is, what are the best health investments for Israel to make? What are the best public infrastructure investments? Should you do Kurzarbeit in Israel? Should you, those are all institution specifics, and I'm going to leave that to Israelis to debate. But I just want to emphasize, my own personal view is, both from an aggregate demand management point of view, that's the new Keynesian in me, but also from a neoclassical perspective, preserving human capital in the face of this short-run tragedy seems to me have very high social returns.
Okay, thank you very much. That was, again, very enlightening. So
I wish I could be there with everyone. I wish I could be there with everyone.
yeah, good. So now we are coming to the end of this conference. So by the way, just it is interesting that you touched upon this philosophical question, because it was really sort of closing a circle. Kobe Glaser, who has started the conference, essentially that was his first issue he has touched upon. So it is a really nice sort of circle that we have now closed. So again, thanks a lot.